So what am I going to cover in this presentation? I want to do a little bit of an introduction to social value firstly, just to give you a feel for where this has come from, what the drivers are, and some of the elements of social value. And hopefully that will help. I'm going to introduce you to a very simple process to help you understand the social value contribution of your business. If we're being asked about social value, then reflecting on what social value means to our business will help us as part of the tender process and as part of winning business with the public sector. But also, I hope you'll see that understanding the social value contribution of the business links to actually just being an excellent business as part of your business strategy. And lastly, I'll offer some personal reflections and answer any questions you have. Please put them in the chat as we're going through, and we'll deal with them at the end. And the personal reflections are around where I see this social value agenda going in the public sector, what are some emerging issues and the things that are going to become more and more important in terms of managing our response. So firstly, a few drivers that you may or may not be aware of. Social value really came into vogue in 2012 with the Public Services Social Value Act, where they started to set out clearer priorities in terms of how and what public procurers should be embedding into procurement. In that initial policy statement, they identified 3 priorities, which are still true today, but they've been extended, to be honest. And those were around creating new business, jobs and skills, tackling climate change, and we'll touch on that as we move forward, and obviously waste management. But the driver was also around increasing supplier diversity, innovation and resilience. Now in 2012, they didn't foresee the COVID and the challenges we've had over the past couple of years. So once again, this has become higher on the agenda. On the 620, the public policy note on social value reinforced these messages and started to ask public sector procurers to think about not just the lowest price, but this concept of value for money. Now, the way that's been interpreted is interesting in terms of the extra value the public sector are trying to get from the suppliers. But the key point here is on the agenda. The importance of social value is increasing within the public sector, and suppliers are being asked to demonstrate their contribution as part of the tenders. And even more so, there's a 10% weighting that many public sector organisations are starting to put as part of the invitation to tender. And they're getting better at assessing that. But you will, in some cases, be asked to demonstrate your social value contribution as part of your tender. And the weighting for that is often 10%, which is the public sector guidance. So it's on the agenda and it's not going away. But in terms of understanding social value, I wanted to just explore a very briefly the background to this concept and why I don't believe it's as scary as it might look on first viewing. And to do this, I just want to talk about the language. So I've worked in sustainability and social value my whole career. When I first started in this area, not many people were doing it, to be honest. And the language we were talking about then was around sustainability, sustainable development. And so we had language of sustainable development, language of social responsibility. And over the years, this language set around this agenda has developed more and more. So we have things around ethical business practice, responsible business practice, obviously social value, the concept of civic responsibility. And civic responsibility has been adopted by many universities and local authorities, obviously, in terms of their demonstration, their contribution to the community. So this language set has been developed, and to be honest, it's confused. I will routinely work with organisations that will have a social value strategy, a sustainability strategy, and also been talking about corporate social responsibility. And the question is why, and I'll explain what's at the heart of this in a moment. So the language is there. Your organisation might have been talking about sustainability. It might have been talking about environmental sustainability or CSR. Now, if it has been, then actually it puts you in a pretty good place to start thinking about your social value contribution. So the language is there, but we need to get beyond it and beyond the language of social value. I want to take it back a little bit further, and very briefly, I'm not going to dwell on this, but take it back a little bit further to where this began, just to put it in context, because the very first mention of sustainable development went back to 1987 when the World Commission on Environment and Development published the report Our Common Future. Now, this is just a bit of background context. The Brundtland Report, as it became known after Gro Harlem Brundtland, actually set out the issues, the challenges and the opportunities around embedding sustainable development into our practice at a national level and international level and right down to individual businesses. And the very first mention, I believe, of social value and sustainability came with the definition: development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Now, what that meant in reality is that the decisions we make now, it's factoring in that longer term view of how that's going to have impacts. Are we going to manage out unintended consequences? How are we going to think about this in the long term? So that's where it all started. But then if we fast forward to now, the UN issued something called the Sustainable Development Goals. And what these were, the way to think about it is a sustainability action plan for the planet. Now, what these highlighted was a number of challenges that every country was facing, from poverty to health and well-being to issues around gender equality, clean water, sanitation, looking at climate action. And the UN basically got everyone together globally and said, right, what are the challenges that face us all? And how are we going to respond at an international level? Now, why am I telling you this when we're actually thinking about social value within our business and actually as part of the tender process? Now, the reason I'm telling you about this is this and these issues are shaping the social value considerations that are now being embedded in the procurement process. So there's a couple of things here in terms of that, going back to Brundtland and the idea of development that supports future generations, that long-term view, and actually this myriad of interconnected issues around the Sustainable Development Goals. And when we start to break that down in terms of what we're being asked to respond to as part of tenders, an invitation to tenders, you start to see these themes coming out. So that's a bit of the past and a bit of where we are now. But also, as well as these sort of action plans for the planet, what we've also seen in a response to the Social Value Act is local authorities and the public sector saying, actually, how are we going to pull this together and focus our social value contribution? Now, there was a development called the National TOMS Framework, which is Themes, Outcomes, Measures. And this looked to set a minimum standard, a reporting standard of measuring social value. Now, this is a really interesting area in terms of how much you can measure social value, how far you want to measure social value. But what is true today is that in terms of responding to tenders, suppliers are being asked to demonstrate their social value so it can be scored and measured. Now, the TOMS are providing that framework. As I said, they represent themes, which are strategic overarching themes, which I'm going to show you in a second. They look at specific goals and objectives or outcomes of what those themes are trying to achieve, and that's the issue it's trying to address. And it's also got a suggested number of measures in there as well, how a public sector procurer can assess the value and often turning that into a monetary value of the outcome that they've got in place. Now, not everything can be turned into a monetary value, so some of these measures are a little bit woolly, if I'm honest, still, but they're heading in that direction. And when you start to look at the TOMS a little bit more detail, the 5 original themes, and I put the original themes up here rather than the myriad of changes because they keep being updated. They keep being updated all the time. But when you go back to the core themes that they began with, I still think that these are the ones we start off when we're thinking about our social value contribution. And the themes they came out with were around promoting skills and employment, so looking at those development opportunities within the community, supporting the growth of responsible regional business. So as we know, there's a big focus on regions and levelling up and the agenda we hear about all the time. And this is looking at the work of the public sector and how it works with supply chains. This focus, once again, the social focus, if you like, on creating healthier, safer and more resilient communities. So you'll see those 3 there around the sort of social agenda. And then the 4th theme they identified was protecting and improving our environment. So we've got this environmental element. And the reason I mention this social, this economic and this environmental is it does shape actually what's coming and also how our response needs to be. And lastly, it looked at promoting social innovation. So how do you find innovative solutions? And once again, when these first came out and as they're being developed in I want to say post-COVID context, but not quite, the idea of social innovation to respond to some of these inequalities is absolutely critical. And suppliers are being asked what their role is in that. So we've got the themes there. And going back to the language I mentioned earlier, the reason I started with that myriad of language and then took you through the Sustainable Development Goals and looked at the TOMs and the themes is that behind all of the language sets, behind the TOMs, behind the SDGs are the same things. And that is, how do we as an organisation embed the environmental and social and economic elements that are relevant to our business? And all the language has done is it's reprioritized those three things in a slightly different way. So when we talk about social value, people often jump to the socio-economic first and the environment seems to lag behind. When we talk about sustainability, they tend to focus on the environmental element first. But the truth is, all of these language sets have the environmental, social and economic embedded in them. And to go slightly further, if we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, which I showed you earlier, these 17 goals for the planet, when you break them down, we can see very clearly this economic, social and environmental, and I've called it biosphere here. And these elements are actually embedded in the goals. Now, they're all intertwined, of course, and they overlap, and that's part of the challenge. But the reality is, even the SDGs focus on environmental, social and economic. And take it further, and I'll show you the themes from the TOMs again. You can see 1 to 3 are socio-economic and 4 is environmental. And we've got this idea of innovation, bringing that up. So the environmental, social, economic is basically at the heart of social value. So what does that mean? What does that mean for us when we're responding to tenders, when we're actually developing our social value thinking? What do we need to do? Well, when I run training courses for public procurers and businesses of all shapes and sizes, I try to break it down to the simplest level for me more than anyone else. And when I talk about sustainability and social value, I describe it like this. It's about how, as an organisation, we understand our social impact and value. So firstly, we need to understand it. And then secondly, can we actually ramp it up? Can we say, well, if we're having this social good, how much more can we do within the bounds of our normal business practice and around the edges of our business practice in terms of with our staff and with our community? And the same with the economic. And I talk about economic value. I'm not talking here about how we just make more money as a business. I'm actually talking about how we contribute to the economic well-being of different people in the community, disadvantaged groups, how it's linked to the economic element, how it links to our staff and builds and grows a business. So it's economic and value rather than just growth for growth's sake. And lastly, but importantly, it's actually recognizing those environmental impacts we have and saying, do you know what we're actually going to do is systematically reduce this. Now, when I first started off in the world of sustainability, I had to convince people that this was an issue. I spent the first 10 years of my life saying, actually, what's the business case for this? We should be doing this sustainability thing. But the reality is now it's just a given. As a business, it's a given that actually we should be looking at those environmental elements. And I'm going to show you how to do that as part of the next section. But to summarize, when I think about social value, it's the consideration of that social, economic and environmental. It's how do we reduce some of those negative impacts and enhance the others. And it's doing that over the long term. It's thinking in that long-term approach, because that can change our plans, our actions and our behavior. So sustainability and social value are the same thing. So if you already had a sustainability strategy, actually, to be honest, you could probably change the title to social value and ensure that you're covering those three elements and you're halfway there. I want to throw one more thing in before we finish this section over the next 2 slides. And that's an approach I developed a number of years ago. I'll just share with you, which is around a net positive approach to sustainability or social value. And implicitly, what we're trying to do as a business is recognize where our positive and negative impacts are. So how we're affected by society, the economy, and the environment, and then actually how we have an impact on those three elements as well. And so a healthy social value plan is one that actually understands the negative impacts, environmental, primarily here around carbon, waste, plastics, etc. Many environmental issues, but also recognise the social contribution it has, the value it brings, and is clear about that value when communicating to customers. And once again, tries to ramp that value up because it takes those opportunities. So in terms of sustainability and social value and that net positive approach, if as you're developing your plans, you actually understand the environmental, social and economic impacts you have as a business, if you recognise and own the negative impacts in a mature response as part of a business strategy and systematically try to reduce those negative impacts, then you're on the right lines. And also if you look at the contribution you make implicitly as part of your business strategy, but then also tries to ramp that up and develop that further, then we've got a really nice balance between that reducing the negative and enhancing the positive. And if we build in this long-term approach, then we're actually in a really good place to start to respond to the social value requirements and be confident in the language and how we discuss that with our customers. And all of this relates to core business practice. It's the only place to start, looking at your business activities and contribution. So what I've tried to do there is sort of describe sustainability and social value. In summary, they're the same thing. They're the same thing, but taking ownership of that as an organisation and developing your plans is a really good place to start. So that's the introduction to social value.